Happy New Day, my new viewers, my new subscribers, and my oldies. Welcome to Elmina Castle and Slave Dungeons 1482. At the center of this castle is the girl Chinasike of Africa, a Nigerian tourist in Ghana. No matter the part of the continent or country you are viewing me from today, you are my co-tourist. Let's go in to educate ourselves with the historical significance of Elmina Castle. Learn about Ghanaians' diverse culture through a guided tour with a local guide, sharing the story and tradition that highlights the heritage of people who lived around the castle for centuries.
Okay.
More. But before we start at all, I'd like to brief you the history of this castle. Then we proceed with the tour. This castle was built by the Portuguese in the year 1482.
Okay.
The first European country to arrive here was the Portuguese in the year 1470. They came for two reasons: to trade and to spread Christianity. At that time, the system of trade was termed as barter, that is, exchange of goods for goods. So the Portuguese came along with their European goods, such as tobacco, guns, gunpowders, cheap fabric, mirror, and many more. In exchange for our locals, their iron, spices, and gold. But their main interest was on the gold, because our locals then were giving the Portuguese more of the gold than the iron and the spices. So the Portuguese saw that this community was actually enriched with gold. And then they named the community in their Portuguese languages as Elmina, or Elmina, or Elmina, which means the man. But then our locals, because they were not that intelligent, corrupted those Portuguese languages to be our present-day Elmina.
Okay.
But the original name for this community was Anomansa.
What? Come again?
Anomansa,
Anomanisa.
which means inexhaustible supply of water.
So it's Portuguese language.
Yes.
No, the Anomansa is actually the original language. That is the local language that was named after the community.
Okay.
But Elmina was the corrupted name from the Portuguese language. Now, the Anomansa itself had history behind it. There was a man, he was an hunter. His name was Pa Amampa. He was in his hunting process, then he fell thirsty. So he needed water to quench his thirst. So he was going someplace and saw a water somewhere. So the more he was trying to have the water to quench his thirst, the more water comes in.
Okay.
So he saw that the water was a magical water. So he named the thing as in, the more I drink,
The more I get.
That is
Okay.
Anomansa.
Okay.
Now, he later went back to his community, that was Techiman. He told his family about the water he found
Okay.
in a certain place. So then the family said they want to come and witness. So those family, the man and his family came. They came to drink the water, and the same thing applied. So the family went back and told the
Get more
chiefs.
people. Okay.
And the chief then sent some of his people to add up to the family and come to the place. So when they came, this time around, those people didn't go back again, but rather settled.
Settle here.
And that brought about the Elmina community.
Okay.
So initially it wasn't a community,
Community. Okay.
but from one person to another, then it became community. Now, because Paramampa was the man who discovered the water, he was named or taken as the chief
Of the community. Okay. Pamaka.
That is how Elmina came about. Now, the Portuguese, however, spent 155 years in this castle. in the early 16th centuries, the Portuguese attention shifted from the gold trading to human or slave trade. Now the question is, why slave trade? Initially, when the Portuguese came, they came with two intentions: to trade and to spread Christianity. And so, they were doing the normal trading with the locals. They did that for 35 good years. Now, please have a look. The remaining 115 years was used for slave trade by the Portuguese. So the Portuguese eventually totally spent 155 years in this castle, both normal trade and slave trade. Now in 1637, there was a fight between the Dutch and the Portuguese. But then before the fight, the Dutch were already in Ghana, but located in a place called Mori. It's 20 kilometers from here to that place. When the Dutch were there, the Dutch settled there and then began the normal trading with the locals. Please, have you ever heard of Fort Amsterdam?
Fort Amsterdam.
Fort Amsterdam. That fort was built by the Dutch, and that was where the Dutch settled in to start with the normal trading with them. Mori. Yeah. Now, the Dutch realized that the Portuguese were actually making more profits than them. Because why should two European countries doing the same business, but yet
one is
of them
progressing.
is getting more money than them? And they got to realize that the Portuguese were actually doing slave trade, not the normal trade.
Okay.
So they saw that doing the slave trade had money in it. So then the Dutch had this jealousy thing for the Portuguese. So the Dutch tried some attacks on the Portuguese. They eventually tried 2 attacks in 2 different years, but it was never successful. They were all defeated by the Portuguese. And it happened in the year 1596 and 1625. Now I would like to demonstrate how it failed. The Portuguese were already in the castle as they settled in. When the Dutch were making their attacks, they were coming from the sea land. Now, let's do some calculations here. Among somebody on the land and somebody on the sea, whom do you think can have the best shot to kill? Exactly. So the Portuguese had the right, correct target to kill the Dutch. That was why their attacks was never successful in 2 different years. But in 1637, the Dutch were helped by the locals. Now, why did the locals help the Dutch? Initially, when the locals were doing normal business with the Portuguese, they were happy. So the Portuguese started the slave trade. And the Dutch realized that when the Portuguese realized, no, the locals realized that when the Dutch were in Mori, they were actually doing the normal business with the locals. So then it means if they should capture the castle from the Portuguese, they are going to put a stop to the slave trade and also be doing a normal business with them. That was the intentions of the locals helping the Dutch. So our locals made the Dutch to hide in a certain place called the inland. It's a hill. There was nothing like a building here. So our locals helped them to hide here. So in 1637, this time around, they were not just coming from the sea land, they also came from the inland. But because the Portuguese, in their mindset, they thought the Dutch would definitely come from the sea land. They were making more of their attacks from the sea land. So by the time the Portuguese realized the Dutch in the inland has already started bombarding the castle. So by the time they were turning themselves to fight against the Dutch in the inland, then those Dutch soldiers have already surrendered the castle. So the Portuguese had no other option than to give out the castle to the Dutch. Because I've been defeated. So what's next for me to do? If I try to fight with them, my men will still die. So how to surrender? And that's what the Portuguese did. So they gave the castle to the Dutch. Now, when the Dutch took over in 1637, they also tricked the locals by doing normal business with them for about 30 years. They used 205 years for slave trade. The Portuguese used 25 years for normal trading. but use the remaining 115 years
For slave
for
trade.
slave trade. When the Dutch took over, the Dutch came to use 30 years for normal trade and used 205 years for slave trade. Now, when you do some calculations, almost 400 years was used by the Dutch and the Portuguese in this castle for slave trade. Now, in 1814, the abolishment of the slave trade was done, but it was done illegally. They abolished the slave trade, documented, but the Dutch were illegally doing it, passing the African slaves underground. But in the 1860s and 1870s, that was when it was totally abolished. Now, something that gives me money, now the thing is no more. What's next for me to do? You have to run away.
Run your way.
So before going, they sold the castle to the British. But then, the British were also in Ghana, but located in Cape Coast. I will never say the British were sent, no. The British also engaged in the slave trade. But they used the Cape Coast castle for their slavery. So after buying Elmina castle, they made this castle to be their sub-administrative center. So more like their offices were here. And this is where colonization of Ghanaians really started from. Now, in 1948, that same British used this castle to be their police training school during the Second World War. So the British brought African men from West African countries here to train those men so that those men can fight for the British in Burma and India. The question is, where did the British get those African men from? We do know that the British actually colonized some countries before coming to Ghana. So those countries that British colonized, those African men were gotten out of those countries and they were brought here. So the British never used their English people, no. They used the Africans to fight for them. The British spent 85 years in this castle. Now, 6th of March 1957 was when Ghana gained their independence. That same year was the year Ghanaians were able to get their properties from the British. Ghana spent 68 years in this castle, while the British spent 85 years. So when you put all the numbers that I've mentioned, the Portuguese spending 155, the Dutch spending 235, the British spending 85, and Ghana spending 68. When you sum these numbers up, this castle is 543 years old. The largest, biggest, and the oldest castle in the whole tropical Africa is this castle. Now, as far as slavery is concerned, this castle took about 1,000 enslaved Africans at a time. 600 men, 400 women. And also, when the Portuguese came, they came with the intentions of normal trading. That is, the exchange of goods for goods, and also Christianity. So they made all the damn floors in this castle to be their storerooms. And when they started the slave trade, that was when it was converted from storerooms to slave dungeons. Now I want to give you the difference between Cape Coast Castle and Elmina Castle. For Cape Coast Castle, that castle was built purposely for slave trade because their slave dungeons goes down. And when I talk about the real slave dungeons, then is the Cape Coast Castle. Ours was a converted storage to slave dungeons. But when you talk about where the slave trade started from, then you're talking about Elmina Castle. So this is the difference between the Cape Coast Castle and Elmina Castle. And so this is the brief history of this castle. Now please, I want us to proceed by visiting the females land. Please come in.
All right, thank you.
Yeah, hopefully you all learned a lot from this lecture because our lecturer did an amazing job giving us a brief history of this entire castle in less than 15 minutes. Upcoming next will be a visit to the dungeons under this castle, and we will make available a video to examine all our viewers, students or tourists who seek historical chapters, irrespective of their country's continent, to ascertain their level of understanding towards the lecture given to us by a local guard here in Elmina Castle. Before we wrap up this video, I want to advise each and every one of you to embrace peace. No matter the continent, countryside where you find yourself, no matter your skin color, let's live together in love with heart of humanity. Different colors, same human. May all the African ancestors and foreigners who lost their life under this castle find peace in the bosom of the Lord. May those who return find their roots, and may the living embrace peace. Make the earth peaceful for upcoming generations.